How's it going, everyone, and welcome in for another edition of the unofficial WCC Hoops podcast. Big Saturday. This past weekend had 9 of the 11 teams in action. Some really good basketball played over the weekend. Some big results. Uh, Gonzaga falling to Kentucky. St. Mary's getting a big win at Utah. LMU beating Nevada. USF back on Thursday, taking care of St. Louis. A lot of really good action to kind of recap, to go over and talk about what that looks like going forward into this kind of long, empty week for the most part on the WCC calendar. It's finals week for most schools, so a lot of them will not be playing a game this week up until this coming Saturday, when again we'll have 9 of the 11 teams in action on that day. We'll talk to Rocco Miller from Bracketeer, and then also the mid-major show from Field of 68. So we'll talk with him once again about all of the implications of what we saw this weekend, what we might see kind of in the next couple weeks going forward before WCC play begins, and also who has set themselves up best as we get closer and closer to the start of conference play. And the one I want to start with, before we get into anything else, is Washington State. This is a team that going into last week, couple weeks, I made note that Cedric Howard was going to miss some time, and I was a little concerned once the report came out that he was going to be out for an extended period of time, what this was going to look like in largely their toughest stretch of their non-conference schedule. They were at the Acrisure Holiday Invitational. Then they were going to take on Nevada and also Boise State in this stretch. And I looked at this and I was a bit concerned. They had been playing well, but also not so well enough that could you survive without your best player for an extended period of time. Always think about you might be able to do it for a game or two, but what does that look like over a longer stretch? And 4 games in to this window of no Cedric Howard, the Cougs are 3-1 and have probably had their best 2 games in the last 2 outings against Boise State, against Nevada, getting wins against both of them. Impressive in both of those, had leads of 20 plus points in each of those contests. Washington State is starting to really click, and they had been playing well, but now it looks like it's starting to all come together. And maybe more so than anything, it's on the defensive end of the floor. What we've seen so far, Nevada, again, in the game against Nevada, they held them to a season low 57 points. A few nights later, when they head over to Boise, they held Boise State to a season low 37% from the field. Held them to their second worst 3-point shooting game of the season at 25%. In both of these contests, holding their opponents to under 40% from the field, 25% or lower in both of these contests. And these are 2 schools, Nevada and Boise State, who were in the NCAA tournament a year ago. In both cases, have aspirations of returning to the NCAA tournament. So this is, again, a very big deal of what we have seen in this past week. Getting 2 wins away from home, a true road win at Nevada, and a semi-road win. It's technically neutral site, but they were playing in Boise for that contest against the Broncos. That should really have counted as a home game for Boise. In any case, still going away from home, away from Pullman, and getting these 2 victories, it caught a lot of attention across the college basketball world, especially once they jumped out to that 20-point lead on Saturday, on what was largely a college football Saturday, but a ton of happenings for college basketball. And while I was just sitting at a pregame, because I made the trip up to Utah to go watch St. Mary's, I was watching their game, and it popped up that they were up by 20 throughout the course of that first half. So a wildly impressive showing for Washington State in that one. Lawan Watts, 20 points, 11 rebounds, 6 assists. He's been great. really all season long, but he's stepped it up in Coward's absence. We've seen it kind of all across the board. Guys for Washington State stepping up to pick up the pace for Cedric Coward not being in the lineup. David Riley has done a great job through the first 10 games of this first season with the Cougs. And while the numbers are not great, they are far better than where they were, say, 2 weeks ago. After the SMU loss, there was obviously some concern over what the next few weeks were going to look like. They had lost in a big way by 16 to the Mustangs. This was a squad that really outplayed them in all facets in that one. But going into this week, what were they going to be able to do bouncing back off of that? And we saw what they were able to do. So they're 75 in KenPom. They're 68 in the net, 62 in Bart Torvik. So there are definitely some numbers that are helping this squad out. They have 3 more non-conference games before we hit the start of league play. They host Missouri State. They're going to be at Washington, and then they're going to be neutral for Northern Iowa. None of these games are really going to help the metrics, but what these games are going to give them the opportunity to have is at least a few more pieces to bolster or at least solidify what they've already done to this point. Again, like you look at the games that they have played, Nevada, I think, is going to age better. Boise should age better, albeit Boise is starting to kind of teeter, I think, a little bit. They lost to USF earlier in the non-conference. They've lost to Washington State, and they'll take on St. Mary's this weekend as part of like their three-piece of WCC teams. Nevada, kind of little similar, where they just lost to LMU at home. Tip of the cap to LMU for getting that job done. Big win for the Lions, but not a great look for Nevada, as that's the sort of game that they really should have taken care of business. But maybe Nevada is starting to show some cracks in the armor as they got off to a great start, but have looked not so great in the past week. So again, for Washington State, these last 3 games before non-conference should at least solidify kind of what they've done to this point. And we're going to talk to Rocco Mill a little bit about like the Washington State case, because in my mind, it's like I look at what they've done and I'm a little confused as why some of the numbers aren't more favorable to this team, because they have a similar win like USF, and then they've taken care of business. They've taken care of business against better teams, I think, than what USF has been able to do to this point. But I get there's something to be said about style points, and a lot of these metrics take style points into account. And when USF has beaten up on teams, they have crushed teams. We have yet to really see Washington State do that to anyone. Now, these next few teams, Missouri State, Washington, Northern Iowa, I think are going to be tougher contests on that front. Missouri State is a team that this squad could absolutely start to take off and run out against. If they can get a big blowout win, it's going to do a lot to help their metrics before we get to WCC play, where even then they're going to have to do some work. Probably, if you're talking NCAA tournament, if we're starting to look forward on that a little bit more, probably a 3rd place finish I think is maybe a necessity, but at the very least, a win against either Gonzaga or St. Mary's will likely be necessary to get them closer into the consideration component. But we'll get into that with Rocco in just a bit. But impressive outing for Washington State in the early going, or not in early going, but in the first week of December. They look like they're pointing in the right direction. They're playing well. They're getting contributions from all across the board, and the defense is playing its best ball of the season. Now, the one I also want to get to and talk about, because there's definitely some back and forth conversation about St. Mary's and the job that they have done to this point. Now, metrically, they are doing everything I think that many probably expected them to do. They're a top 35 team in both the net and in KenPom. They're a top 30 team in Bart Torvik. They're doing a really good job here in the non-conference. And they did pick up a big road win at Utah. They won 72-63. They won this game by 9. They were up by 19 at one point, but they let this game get down to a 2-point contest in the second half. And if not for probably the heroics of Paulius Morauskas, who had career high 29 points, 18 of which were in the second half, we may not be having the conversation about St. Mary's is 9-1 and getting its first road win of the season. We're probably talking about what is going on with the squad, because we saw it against Arizona State. They had a lead and they let that one slip away. They had a lead against UTSA. They let that slip away and get to overtime. They played Utah. We're up by 19 and let that lead slip away, nearly completely slip away, but still ended up coming out on top. Little bit of maybe the concerning trend, losing these big leads, losing a big lead, losing a big lead. So there's room to grow, room for improvement, because that is obviously not great, especially when what we have seen in these 3 contests is that out of the gate in the second half is when these problems have occurred. We have not seen St. Mary's make great adjustments out of the halftime. Out of halftime in these games. Arizona State did a really good job of making adjustments. Utah made a really good job of making adjustments. UTSA did a good job of making adjustments. And it took a while for St. Mary's to adjust back. Figured it out against UTSA eventually. Figured it out against Utah eventually. But in each of these contests, you can say like, oh, well, they didn't have this, they didn't have that. Bottom line is that they did let teams back in. And that is concerning. The defense wasn't as good in the second halves of those games, even though it was really good in the first half against Utah. Mitchell Saxon not being available for much of this game. He fouled out in 10 minutes. So that is also a little bit of a concern, that you had a fifth-year starter not available quite often in the contest. But Andrew McKeever came in and was really good for this squad. I really liked what he was able to contribute. He really is like, he's been the third center on this team this season, but he came in after not only did Mitchell Saxon get 2 fouls, but also Harry Wessels picked up 2 early fouls. And McKeever, 6 points, 8 rebounds in his 21 minutes. So good showing for him. But that is concerning that we had to get to him. You had 2 different centers pick up early foul trouble and continue to stay in foul trouble throughout the course of the game against a Utah team that really was actually kind of going blow for blow with St. Mary's in the paint. So not having your best defender, your best center in there was a big sticking point in that contest. And the problem in a game like this is that you know that Utah obviously like is a big Power 4 team, whatever else. But this is not a team that is going to likely finish top half of their league. This is a team that, if maybe, will get some level of an NIT bid. So there has to be a concern about that they're letting teams that may not be NCAA tournament quality teams get back into these contests, whether it be on the road, at home, neutral. It's happened everywhere for St. Mary's, and that's troublesome. All that said, guess what? They're still 9-1. And a year ago, this team was 4-5. A year ago, with maybe saying like there were similar problems to the team last season, they wouldn't have won these games. They wouldn't have beaten Utah if this was the same team a year ago. They wouldn't have beaten UTSA if this was the same team a year ago. They only lost by 4. The one loss they have is only by 4 to a team that actually might be NCAA tournament good when it's all said and done. And those games last year would have gotten completely away from the Gales. Think about the San Diego State game that got away from them, the Xavier game that got away from them, Weber State that got away from them. They're not losing those games anymore. They're finding ways to still close out those contests, even if it's not pretty at the end of them. They're finding ways to win ball games in situations where a year ago they didn't do that. And now you think about where they are today. They're 9-1, and they're going into a game against Boise State this weekend. They still have Utah State in about another week and a half. They still have meat on the bone for their resume, and they've already put together a pretty good non-conference schedule as it is. Getting a win against Nebraska, getting a win against USC, getting a win at Utah. They're starting to put that together. They have put that together. 9-1. It's putting you in a position that once you get to conference play, you don't have to do maybe what you did a year ago to win the conference outright. You don't have to win the tournament to get a 5 seed. Again, that's where we're talking about. The St. Mary's squad starting to look very comfortably as a tournament team, where obviously this time a year ago we were talking about them not making the postseason at all. And I think the leadership of this team has been obviously one part of it. I don't think Augustus Marciulionis has played well, but he's been a good leader for the squad. Saxon has been a good leader for them. We were already starting to see other guys start to take more leadership roles. Morauskas, I think, has been a good part of that. We're starting to see him just take over ball games when needed. We've started to see that from also Jordan Ross from time to time. Over these last couple of weeks, it actually has been a lot of these other guys who have stepped up into roles to really kind of be the leader of the squad. We've seen it be Jordan Ross. We've seen it be Morauskas. We've seen it be Luke Barrett. We've seen it be a number of guys on this roster, and it hasn't always had to be Marciulionis or Saxon. And that's a good thing for this team, that you're not relying on the same couple of guys that you have been relying upon in the last 2 years. Now that you have a third, a fourth, a fifth guy who might be able to step up into that just adds to the depth of the squad, and it helps on the offensive end, because now defenses can't lock in at least any one of them or any two of them. They really are able to spread this out a little bit more and have better balance on the offensive end. That is something that maybe did not exist on this squad a year ago. So, thinking about Washington State, they're in a good position right now. St. Mary's in a good position right now. The one that's also obviously in a good position right now, but I'm not going to read too much into what happened on Saturday is. Gonzaga losing to Kentucky in dramatic fashion, 90-89 in overtime in the battle in Seattle. This was a very similar game almost to the St. Mary's game on Saturday, where they had a 16-point lead at halftime and they coughed it up. And they had the force overtime with Kentucky, went to overtime, and really this was just a complete momentum shift for the Wildcats in that second half. They controlled essentially the second half and overtime on. Despite some good performances from the Zags, Graham Ike had 28 points, 11 rebounds. Ryan Nembhard had 10 more assists in this one. But they couldn't close another game out. They couldn't close the game out against West Virginia in the opener of the Battle for Atlantis. And they were unable to close out the game against Kentucky on Saturday. I'm not overly concerned about these two games because, again, these West Virginia aside, Kentucky is a high-quality opponent, and as much as I know that Gonzaga fans are going to be like, that's a game they should have won, and yes, they probably should have won that game, it's also against a coach that actually is more familiar with the way Gonzaga runs things than most other power conference schools, power conference coaches are going to be. Mark Pope played in the conference with Gonzaga for a couple of years, so he is very well aware of ways in which you can attack that Gonzaga offense and really kind of like see those rotations a little bit better. And I know I kind of joked a little bit that once they were down 16 at halftime, it's like, oh, Mark Pope might want to cancel his whole series altogether moving forward. But they came back, they made adjustments, and the one thing I think that many know, as seen BYU, seen them over the years, is that Mark Pope is going to know how to actually coach these X's and O's a lot better than maybe his predecessor at Kentucky did. And we saw just just the adjustments that they were able to make that obviously helped them win this ball game. You do have, obviously, star power like Anthony Carrock coming through like he did. And also Jackson Robinson having a really good game as well. For those who remember that name, that's a guy who was on the BYU squad with Mark Pope, came over to Kentucky with him. He played really well in that contest. And Gonzaga in the second half did not shoot well. 0 for 9 from 3 in the second half. They were 6 for 27 overall. And that is something that Gonzaga can't do on the regular if they're going to win these sorts of ball games. They're going to have to shoot better from 3. They're going to have to play with maybe probably a little bit more patience, because there was one possession that drove me nuts. And mainly because it probably resembled an NBA possession. I forgot who took the initial shot, but Gonzaga got the rebound, kicked it back out for 3, missed it. Got another rebound, kicked it back out for 3, missed that one. And seeing 3 threes, all misses in the course of one possession, really almost in a course of like 10 seconds, was really kind of one of those scenarios where slow it down. You don't need that. I know that one of those looks was completely wide open, and I get that. But on that third reload, that felt like one was like, okay, let's slow this down. Let's really think about how we're doing this, running this offensive set, because clearly this was an area where they just were not shooting well at that point. Almost felt like it was going to be like the turning back the clock. I think it's the 2018 Western Conference Finals where the Rockets missed like 27 threes in a row or something like that. Like that's what it started to feel like for Gonzaga in that contest. And I'm not gonna harp on everything that Gonzaga is doing wrong, because again, like they're 7-2. They've had one of the tougher non-conference schedules in the country. I'm not concerned about where they are right now. They've lost 2 games. Their 2 losses are in overtime. One is to a top 5 team. The other one is to a team in maybe the toughest basketball conference in the country, in the Big 12. Debatable this year because the SEC has played so well. Not concerned. They have 2 games coming up. They'll have UConn at Madison Square Garden this weekend. They have a second game against UCLA in a couple of weeks down at the Intuit Dome. So 2 more great opportunities for them in the non-conference to pick up resume wins. As we know, like they're already kind of set up really well. They're top 10 in both Ken Pom. They're top 10 in the net. So this is a team that's going to be in the mix. If they can get these extra couple of wins and really kind of like solidify that top tier, like if they go into conference play 11-2, something like that, they're going to set themselves up really well to possibly be a number 1 seed again. So the sky is falling for Gonzaga. Rough loss. The way it happened is tough, but this team will be fine. I'm not concerned. They have the point guard who will be able to slow them down when needed, but he needs to help everyone else just slow down just a tick in those scenarios. All right. With that, let's get to Rocco Miller. We'll chat with him about where a lot of the teams in the WCC are. We'll talk about USF. We'll talk about Oregon State. We'll also talk a little bit about Santa Clara and if there is any hope for that squad moving forward. It's always great to have Rocco Miller come on. He's now the co-host of the Mid-Majors show with Sean Paul on the Field of 68 network, as, of course, all of his work with Bracketeer.org, one of the bracketologists that we love to kind of like go through his content and see where teams are. So that's kind of what we're going to do here. Rocco, how's the last few weeks been? Obviously, like it's been a nutty last couple weeks in college basketball.
Yeah, it has, and that's why we love it. Good to be back on with you, Zach. And I would just say that we are getting a large mix of results based on the fact that so many of these rosters are new, 67 new coaches across the country, including 2 new schools in the WCC, right? So seeing some differences to our normal WCC patterns with Gonzaga and St. Mary still being the staples of the league, but the emerging Washington State Cougars and the pretty sizzling hot Oregon State Beavers now, they have fallen twice, but the 2 losses are respectable, and in all of their other games, they've been just demolishing teams. So that's exciting for the league. I think the Dons still look very strong as well. So it's been good, I think, overall for the WCC, but there's still a lot of room to achieve more.
Absolutely. Good number of, we've seen a lot of great contests, a lot of good games from a number of conference teams. Still a few left before we hit conference play in just a couple of weeks. But let's start at the top and talk about Gonzaga and St. Mary's and what the work kind of that those two have done. Obviously, we know that Gonzaga's coming off a loss in Kentucky where they coughed up a late lead, kind of similar to like late game situations is what happened against West Virginia, their two losses on the year. But overall, I mean, this Gonzaga team has done a lot of really good things. They're 7-2 still on the year. What have you seen from Gonzaga, like metrically? Because it feels like right now, like maybe they could have been like a 1 or 2, like right now, based on it's starting to look like maybe they're closer to being like a 2 or a 3. But of course, really early on, what's your kind of read on it so far?
Right. Yeah, it is early on, but Gonzaga plays this big national schedule where we're getting a lot of key results early. That's a lot different than a lot of the teams they'll be compared against that will play a lot more bigger games later in the year. So their opportunity is now, and of course they've got the wins over Baylor and Indiana and Arizona State, which interestingly enough, out of those three, Arizona State's having the strongest start. But that game was in the kennel, so they won't get as much credit for winning at home. And they do have UConn and UCLA coming up, which are really critical for their dreams of being a number one seed. I think I had them as a one seed preseason, but my statement from the beginning was if they get through this entire slate with just two losses, they'll be in great position to do so. The WCC gave them a nice favor where their January looks very cushy, and then they'll play a lot of harder conference games in February. So I think Gonzaga's now hit their rope in terms of what I thought preseason they need to do non-conference. They've taken the two losses, and the West Virginia loss, we don't know. That could be an okay loss later, but if West Virginia slips, they weren't expected to be a tournament team, throughout December or even in the Big 12, which would be very difficult to project. That loss could sting more and more as the year goes on, or it could be okay. So we'll wait and see there. But what Gonzaga can control now is figuring out a way to beat UConn in the Garden. Won't be easy. That's a UConn team recovering from the Maui disaster. Looked better in a recent win at Texas. Also beat Baylor themselves in the last week. So that will be a big game, of course. And then UCLA right after Christmas down in the new Intuit Dome, which will be an exciting matchup. And UCLA is playing very well besides one performance. They only have one loss, just one at Oregon. So those two games are critical. If they win both of those, I think they're kind of back on track. If they go 1-1, you might be right. 2-3 seed is kind of where they'd be projected by January. Again, it's a little too early for most of the country, but with Gonzaga, we kind of know what the rest of the needs to look like.
Right. And I mean, and going into the season, we always kind of like thought there was some level of least separation between Gonzaga and the rest of the WCC going into this year. And thinking about those two other games, I was thinking about just with UConn, there's also that kind of reuniting of a familiar villain with Aiden Mahaney, even though like obviously he hasn't played all that particularly well to this point in the season. Even some Zag fans I've talked to are just a little concerned about his presence because that's a dude who obviously like he drops like 20 a game against them specifically. But as you kind of have seen this Gonzaga squad, it's like just on watching them, even in the few times like I know like you're watching a ton of games here and there and whatnot, don't get all the opportunity to see them, but like are they playing kind of like the team you thought we would see, or is there something that maybe they're doing that is a little unexpected?
Yeah, I think for the most part, they've done about what I expected. Now I think the concern is these late collapses. If they avoided both of those, both their losses are in overtime, and both games they had leads in. So that is concerning. They'll need to clean that up, but there's just quite honestly not a lot of teams that can even push them to overtime. So they'll have their opportunities to clean it up. I also think the nice thing about this UConn matchup, I'm glad you mentioned the Mahaney factor. That should get their attention throughout the week. And they do have an entire week, despite probably having finals tests at different points of the week, depending on the individual. That they'll have a full week to prepare for UConn, almost like a football game. And coming off of a loss. College basketball in general, just for the general fan out there, everybody's adjusting game to game, much like football, but usually much more quickly. And when you lose a game, the attention level in the room perks up just a little extra. And when you go from marquee game to marquee game, like Gonzaga's doing this week, I think you're going to see the Bulldogs' best effort for 40 minutes against UConn. And I think UConn's the team that might need to be a little careful, because they might be coming in feeling like they've fixed their issues, having a nice performance on the road, at Texas, getting that win, playing and figuring some stuff out and pulling it out against Baylor. So they're kind of the team I think at risk. I usually like to favor the team. If all other things are equal, the team coming off a loss, they should be hungrier. If Gonzaga doesn't come out hungry in that game, or shows signs of weakness, I think then I'd be a little concerned. But I expect a really valiant Gonzaga effort next Saturday.
Yeah, I expect the same, especially you get the mystique of playing in the Garden as well. So yeah, I think Gonzaga will be pretty pumped on that one.
And that's for the WCC audience, UConn is it's kind of like when Gonzaga plays in Vegas. They have so many alums in New York. The crowd's going to be crazy UConn, but I do know Gonzaga's fans are pretty wild themselves. So I would expect 1,000 or 2 to maybe get out to New York for this game.
Yeah, I'd expect the Zag Nation to travel well to New York for this week.
Big game.
Now, moving on to St. Mary's, and this is a team that is 9-1 coming into the week. They coming off a good win again at Utah. Their another road win, that kind of avenging the loss from a year ago. Their one loss is that 4-point game against Arizona State, who we mentioned earlier, who's looking better and better as the season has gone along. For St. Mary's, like, this is a team that, even though it seems like that they've also have kind of struggled in late game situations over the last week or so, there's bottom line is they're 9-1, and kind of looking at what they are today, how are you feeling about St. Mary's and what their position might be going into the rest of December?
Yeah, I think, behind Morauskas, the emergence of him and still having Marshallonis to lead the ship, and the emergence of Mikey Lewis, Jordan Ross, it's a really exciting team, actually. I think, so far, so good. We've seen St. Mary's, especially last year, stumble early and kind of head-scratching ways. Besides that UTSA game where they let them rally back, St. Mary's was up 11 in that game, let them rally back to force overtime, but they responded well to that. They went to Utah, focused, built that big lead, held on, and won by 9. That's a good road win for anybody, especially St. Mary's. I think they only like to play one real true road game each non-conference season. I think they're tracking right where I thought they'd be, maybe even a little better, actually. And I projected them as a 5 seed at the start of the year, mainly because they're going to have a lot of performances like we saw against USC, Zach. And you know this better than anybody, where they just are totally overprepared, completely take away your top 2 options, maybe top 3 options, and the score just gets really bloody by the end. And that's exactly what happened against USC. They also have a win over Nebraska, which is probably going to age well. And that was out in Sioux Falls. And they still have Utah State coming into Moraga, where, by then they should be even more fine-tuned. They have this Boise State opportunity up in Idaho Central, and that's their downtown Boise arena. I think it's called Idaho Credit Union or something. But my point is, that game, I expect a very focused Gales team again. They lost there last year, purposely rescheduled it. We talked about it at WCC Media Day, actually. So I think overall, St. Mary's handles that Utah State home game, competes well in Boise. I don't even think they have to win it by any means, but I think they're going to gradually just gain distance from the teams they're compared against, like we've seen the last 3 years in that 5 to 6 seed range, where they're consistently winning by double figures. Their net is going to creep up. Not exactly sure where it is right now. I try not to look till January 1st too closely, but it's more about their opponents, and they've scheduled well. And they're like you said, the most important thing right now is they're 9-1, and they don't have a bad loss. Arizona State on a neutral court is not a bad loss right now. So I'm very content with where the Gales are and where they're going.
And I mean, this is a St. Mary's squad. I mean, there's been some complaints or whatnot, but a year ago, to your point, like they were 4-5 at this stage last season,
Exactly.
and
Yeah.
it looked like the wheels were almost starting to come off, and they were able to find a way to turn around. Now you mentioned like the 5-6 seed. Now the one thing I keep thinking about is they were a 5-6 seed a year ago, or ended up a 5
Yeah.
seed a year ago. They won the conference regular season title. They won the tournament title. I do think that the task is far taller this year to kind of check off those two
Yeah.
boxes. But do they need to do those two things to get back to being a 5 or a 6, or are they going to be able to handle it without? And how many times would they have to beat Gonzaga to do that?
If they take a bad loss or two, which they haven't yet, then maybe they will be back in that position. But that's
Hmm.
why they were in that position last year. I think right now, two things are in their favor. One, they've got the 9-1 record. They've got some good wins under their belt that we just referenced, and the league, if anything, gives you more cushion for blows. So if you go lose at Washington State or you go lose at Oregon State, probably isn't going to hurt you too much. Probably isn't going to change very many things in terms of where you belong on the seed list. But if you start taking home losses to a team like Merrimack, who comes in next week, if you lose at home to a team like Pacific, or a team in the bottom half of the WCC, then things change pretty quickly. So I think for St. Mary's, it's just continue to win the vast majority of your games, and in a lot of those wins, just with the way they prepare and the way they beat teams down, they should gradually grow up in all the power metrics, which when you're in that 5-6 range, actually differentiate you from the 7s and 8s, where you're basically your Ken Palm, your net, etc. What we call performance metrics. Bart Torvik's now part of the team sheet as well. But as long as those numbers keep going up, they're going to go up when you beat teams by 15 plus, and sometimes St. Mary's winning by 25 plus. I think a lot of teams they're compared against can't do that against the same level of competition. So that usually favors St. Mary's in a lot of those national comparisons.
Now, a team that we were talking right before we started to record, that a team that has done a lot of those blowouts and has some of those good metrics, Oregon State, is kind of there with a couple other teams like San Francisco and Washington State. This trio of WCC teams is kind of all in a very similar scenario where, at least in USF and Washington State's perspective, they have some good wins. They've performed well. They also have some of those blowouts. Oregon State doesn't have the wins against marquee teams, but they have very much handled the business against teams that they needed to. So when you're looking at this trio, maybe who themselves up the best to this point, and maybe who is the team that still has some work to do.
Well, I'll start with the team that has set them up the best. It's very clearly Washington State, because they've got a true road win at Nevada. Now, going into that game, Nevada was pretty much perfect for the year. I think they were, and now they've lost twice this week. But Washington State getting that on the road in their building was really critical for their resume. And then they also went up to Boise, and de facto, they're going to call it a neutral, I think, on the team sheet. So we have to treat it that way from a bracketology forecasting standpoint. But I think, if Washington State were to be on the bubble by March, A, that would be very exciting for the WCC. B, you start looking at stuff like that a little closer as a committee, just going through the exercise over the years. You start breaking down, okay, how did they build their resume? That game was in downtown Boise, and we're calling it a neutral. So that kind of thing is going to really help them if they can get to the finish line. Obviously, a long way to go. But Washington State right now is the second best in what we call the SOR. It's a resume metric that the committee uses. They're sitting at 83rd, which is very healthy. You want to be, they're 45th in that one, and that is very healthy. Just for reference, I think every team in the top 38 last year got in, so they're right there. They would at least be looked at this moment in the season, and if they can track that way and stay in that top 50, they're going to be really interesting for the committee. They're 83rd in non-conference strength of schedule, so that also is healthy. That's where that 83 number came from. And a lot of teams that are left out at the very end, let's say first four in, last four that didn't get in, a lot of times that difference is the teams that have a 200 or worse non-conference. And if you're in the top 100, you're usually kind of the exception, not the rule. So Washington State great job by Coach Riley and the staff. I was lucky enough to work with them on a lot of these games this going into this year. It's really paying off for them because now they still get a game at Washington. And again, Washington's a little down, but it's a road game, so I don't think it's going to hurt them if they lose. If they win, the resume just continues to impress. And then you get Northern Iowa and Las Vegas. Now, I'm not exactly sure where Northern Iowa is in the net, but I know they just had 2 huge blowout wins last week. So Northern Iowa should be getting back into that top 100 or at least close to it. And if they can get into the top 100, that's a quad 2 for the Cougs. So again, that's the quick summary there, but they're by far in the best position just based on what they've achieved. I think Oregon State, you mentioned them at the beginning. The good news is they don't have a bad loss. The bad news is they don't have a resume. All these home wins, there's an old saying, and it goes, and I can't remember what coach said it, but I totally agree with it. Your resume doesn't start till you win away from home. So the Beavers have not done that. Really not an interesting case study for the committee until they do. But, here's the opportunity ahead. They get UC Irvine, who's undefeated at home this Saturday. That's a massive opportunity. Now, again, if they beat Irvine and Irvine kind of starts to fall back into their traditional Big West, I think they even finished 73 last year. So if we imagine they finish somewhere around there this year, that will still be an important home win. And then Diamond Head Classic is something where I think just because the Beavers missed out on that Oregon win and missed out on the North Texas road win, even though they played pretty well in both, I think Diamond Head Classic, you got to go just win that sucker. Win all 3 of them. And in that field, you have a chance to maybe play Nebraska, maybe play Loyola Chicago, who's undefeated, Zach. So Oregon State's going to have some at-bats in that. And they start with a tricky Charleston game. So if they lose that first game, that opportunity is pretty much out the window. Really critical they beat Charleston in the first game just so they can have those big quad 1 chances against either a Nebraska or a Loyola. And then San Francisco is the last but not least. Of course, San Francisco lost their opportunity in their tournament by losing to Clemson. They didn't get the chance to play Penn State. I thought that really hurt. But you watch San Francisco, and I covered them last week against St. Louis. They certainly have the look of a team that can perform at a tournament level. And really all that's left from the non-conference standpoint is this Midwest swing starting on Sunday. They get Loyola Chicago, that team I just mentioned, in Milwaukee. Huge game there. They win that. They can start to build off something away from home, resume-wise. And then you get the road Bradley game. Bradley is one of the top mid-majors right now as well, and you're playing them on the road. So if that Midwest trip goes well, very difficult trip, but if it goes well, they can get both. They're going to be really interesting really quickly. If they split, they're kind of still in the same boat where they are now, and they're going to have to build their resume in the WCC to have a chance.
Yeah, USF obviously they got that early Boise win, and then they kind of missed the opportunity. I think almost the one that keeps striking me is that Boise's Memphis game that they just missed to get that one.
Oh, I know, and even the Clemson game, I think they played a great first half, and then it was really unfortunate. They just totally collapsed in the second half, and the Memphis one too. They were in great shape in the last media timeout, did not close strong. Memphis found a way to beat them. Just some really frustrating end of game situations for the Dons, but they clearly have a really talented roster and really starting to figure some stuff out. They dominate the teams that are not on their level. So they've got all that figured out. Now they got to figure out how to win the tight ones and beat some teams on their level, and then they can get the committee's attention.
The continued trek for USF these past 2 years.
It's been hard.
Get some of those wins against those teams.
That's right.
Yeah, they figured out how to handle everyone else.
Yeah, and I've watched Loyola Chicago. They barely squeaked out a win at home against South Florida. If they get that level of Loyola Chicago, San Francisco could be good enough to just go out and run away from them. But playing that game in the Central Time Zone, not far from Chicago, certainly easier said than done. And then Road Bradley, I really respect the heck out of that program. I think Bradley's home fans are wild, extremely wild, and it's going to be a madhouse, I think. But it's a Wednesday night. We'll talk. We'll see what happens in 9 days. But I think that win could go a long way because Bradley's extremely experienced. They were one of the top 10 experienced teams coming into the season. really hungry for a championship. They don't get an opportunity to play a team like San Francisco at home almost ever. So that's a big test for the Dons, no matter what.
Now, maybe the team that is the most frustrating or confusing has been Santa Clara to this point.
Yeah.
They're 5-5 right now. We've seen the height of what they can do. Obviously, getting that win against St. Louis early on, they beat TCU. But then you have losses like North Dakota State. This team has been up and down all year long. From a team that had really high expectations coming in, I know the metrics are still having them. They are in full survival mode at this point. What for your read on Santa Clara? What do you see, and what chance do they have to even get back into the conversation if there is one at all?
Yeah, I think it's going to be difficult to get into the conversation anytime soon. They only have 3 non-league games left, and it starts with a really good test. That Bradley team I just typed up, Zach, they play them in Henderson, Nevada this Saturday. So they'll get the first crack at the Braves, and then the Dons will get them a few days later. But even a neutral court win over Bradley can't really make up for 2 home losses. I mean, that's really tough. Stanford, you would hope they can turn it around and have a good year. Stanford had a win at Cal this last weekend, but still coming in around 100th, and that's a home loss. North Dakota State loss goes without saying. That's going to probably be a quad 4 loss for the whole year. You got to live with that. Very impressive week to go to McNeese. Not only to go to McNeese, most teams won't, but to win there, I think that will age very well. But I think, the conversation really only becomes a thing if they can really get into the top 3 of the WCC, and not just be in the top 3. They've got to knock off one of the top 2 at least once, maybe twice. And let's say they split with both Gonzaga and St. Mary's, handle the rest of their business somehow. Then they start to get really interesting, I think, because they'll have a mix of results. Right now, just to give you an idea, right now they're all the way down to 150 in strength of resume. Those home losses were really killing them. But again, I think some of those things would start to accelerate back to in a good direction. Of course, getting primetime wins like that later on in league, they'll want to handle their business here to finish up, because not only is Bradley going to be a tough one this Saturday, but I covered that Kennesaw State team up in Canada for 3 days, and they've got a lot of young talent. If they're not careful, Kennesaw State could come to Santa Clara and knock them off as well. So they've got to just handle their business in front of them. Then, of course, they get that road San Francisco game on December 30th. Be their second conference game. That's pretty exciting. If they can get through the rest of December with those 5, they have a couple gimmies in there that they got to win. That's South Dakota and Pepperdine. If they get those 5, then they're 10-5. A road San Francisco win, a neutral Bradley win, a road McNeese, a neutral TCU. Then we've got something interesting brewing. But right now, they're pretty far away from the conversation.
Yeah, I'll touch shortly on a team that maybe is going to end up playing spoiler at this stage, and that's LMU. They've started to play well the last couple of weeks. They're getting a win against Belmont. They win against Wyoming. They beat Nevada at Gersten Pavilion. They're starting to look more like the team we thought we would see from the beginning. Obviously, they're not in the picture at all at this point, but are they going to be a team once they get the conference play that some of these others toward the top are going to have to really, you can't fall asleep against this squad because they are talented enough to get some wins?
They are talented. Yeah, they're really talented. And it's always been a tough thing with Stan Johnson's teams there. And I think this is the 4th go around now. What you're going to get. They've had some really disappointing results. They've had some really eye-popping wins. I think one thing they're doing really well this year, they're number 1 in the nation in taking care of the ball. So that's a really key ingredient to winning. And they're starting to figure out how to leverage their rotation a little bit better. Javon Porter and, Alex Merkvaladze were tremendous in that win over Nevada. But how consistent are those guys? That's been tough to figure out. They've also just struggled, I think, on the glass. So there's some teams in the WCC that might own them in the glass. So they got to find other ways to win. Obviously, shooting the ball well is a really key component to that. So yeah, I think they're going to have their nights. Just to answer your question, I'm going to take that safe middle ground answer because they're going to have their nights where they're going to really pop, but then they have nights where they're just kind of outmatched. Not talent wise, just physicality and some other factors, maybe some bad shooting. So I think they're respectable enough, at least to you have to every team in this league, even all the way up to Gonzaga, has to take them seriously, and that's good for the league.
Yeah, and as we got out of here, what's your road trip or what's your what's your travel schedule going to be for the next couple weeks, and where can people find you?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. So yeah, the rest of the week I'll be around here, the Bay Area. Might get out to another game or two. But starting Sunday, looking at a Midwest visit through, starting with Milwaukee. Actually, get that San Francisco, Loyola, Chicago, part of a triple header, and that will launch a little bit of a road journey where I would be at Northern Iowa Monday, at Kansas City Tuesday, which is a big game between Drake, an undefeated team, and Kansas State, a Power Five. Really good opportunity for the Bulldogs, chance to showcase them. And then get down to Albuquerque Wednesday, New Mexico, VCU. They were projected to be two of the top teams in their league early in the year and help put that series together, actually. So looking forward to that. And then after the Christmas holiday, still up in the air, looking at a potential Conference USA visit down there. But obviously, when I'm here, pretty good chance I'll be at a WCC building, so I'll keep you posted.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Rocco, for hopping on. Always great to chat with you. Middle December, like conference play. I mean, for bigger conferences already started to pop here and there, but WCC play, couple weeks away. Some big matchups still. So a lot that we'll get into down the road. Thanks a lot for hopping on. Always good to chat.
Anytime, Zach. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
I thank Rocco Miller one more time for hopping on and talking just what we have seen so far in the non-conference and where a lot of teams are positioned. I was a little surprised to hear him say that he thinks St. Mary's is still about a 5 or a 6 seed. I think that would come as a surprise actually to probably many who are kind of doom and gloom about what St. Mary's can be or what they are. Again, like if they're in position to be a 5 seed again, the 4th straight 5 seed, that just speaks so much to the way they put together this schedule, the careful way that, again, like Randy Bennett has figured out a way to build not only a tournament caliber schedule, but giving them enough opportunities that is going to give them a chance to be a higher seed in the tournament. And like years and years, we talked about how St. Mary's was just getting in like 10 seeds, 11 seeds. For a while, the highest seed they had ever gotten was 7, and that team had to be, I think they won 28 games to just get into the tournament. Now we're looking at a team that is going to be more battle tested, but also is, again, strategically scheduling some of these games, the Towsons, the Chattanoogas. You look at, again, like even one like UTSA, like there are some strategically placed ones in addition to the Marquees, the USCs, the Arizona States, the Boise's, whatnot. Like all these games, like really have helped kind of like solidify what the resume with St. Mary's has had the last few years. And it turns out we're seeing it one more time. Randy Bennett should be really applauded for that one. And Washington State being maybe the best, that's the best of the rest at this stage. Some of the metrics may not like them, but clearly Rocco has seen enough from them that it says that they are probably in the better position when we look at potential tournament resumes, tournament caliber schedules, than maybe USF because of some of the missed opportunities that they've had. All right, and then one more shout out. I did want to mention Pepperdine has had 2 back-to-back blowout wins, so they've played at least a little bit better. The Grambling State win 85-57. Stefan Todorovic again with 22. He continues to just be a scoring machine at this point of the season. And the Waves, they're not. It's still going to be a rough go once they get into WCC play, but it does start to look like they're piecing it together as they start to wrap up their non-conference schedule as well. All right. Well, that'll do it for this episode of the unofficial WCC Hoops podcast. Be sure to hit the subscribe button, follow along on your favorite social media channels at Post by Zach, at unofficial WCC pod. We'll do an episode later this week where we'll talk about the 9 games that are going to be going on Saturday. So a lot of college basketball this weekend, including USF taking on Loyola, but that'll be Sunday. St. Mary's taking on Boise, UConn and Gonzaga, and then Washington State has another big matchup this week, and I just lost where it was. But again, like, this is another squad. Oh, actually, it's not Washington. Oregon State is the one I was thinking of, as they all take on UC Irvine. Another big matchup for them this weekend. So a lot of fun coming up, and we'll go over to some of those games later on in the week. That'll do it. Thanks for watching, everybody, and I will catch you later.